Laurence Fox has just published a new report. It's been commissioned by the Reclaim Party and it's called In Protection of Freedom of Speech. You can see the report here and it can be freely downloaded from the internet. I'll try and leave a link for you. It has a foreword by Jonathan Sumption and a preface by Laurence Fox. And I found it fascinating reading, so much so that I thought I'd bring it to your attention so that you could have a look at it yourself. The report comes in a number of parts. There are actually 8 parts altogether. And the first part is the foreword by Jonathan Sumption. He, as you will recall, is the ex-law lord, not strictly speaking a law lord, because he wasn't a member of the House of Lords, he was a member of the Supreme Court. But technicalities aside, let me say what his foreword says and read you some of that to introduce the report. He talks about the danger to free speech in any society, and he says this: the danger comes when knowledge is not just an essential tool of government, but a public monopoly. This is what happens when approved bodies are empowered to determine what knowledge is true and what knowledge is valuable. It's a significant step on the road to despotism, he says, because it's based on the notion that intellectual inquiry and the dissemination of ideas should be subordinated to authority. And that, I think, is a key point. Which is it that comes first or on top? Is it the truth or is it authority? To which should we owe allegiance? Does the truth owe allegiance to authority, or does authority owe allegiance to the truth? Well, in many despotic states, the authority believes it comes out on top. No matter what the truth is, it has the power to manipulate it to its ends and probably considers them good ends for the good of the state. Anyway, he says that ideas become subordinated to authority, and it reflects a view of society as a single organism, which must have a single collective notion of what is true and what is good. In other words, there can be no deviations from that common view of the common good. Many people who are convinced of the rightness of their own opinions take this view. They regard dissent as inherently antisocial, even treasonable, he says. This is amongst the hallmarks of a totalitarian society. Don't deviate from the narrative of what the state says is true, or we will consider you an enemy. That's been the case for many totalitarian states, and we had many examples, particularly in the last century. Jonathan Sumption goes on to give us some examples of this. He says, recently the Royal Society, which is Britain's premier scientific society, proposed, quote, legislation and punishment of those who produce and disseminate false information, particularly about vaccines, he says. What they mean by false information is information which is inconsistent with the scientific consensus, as defined by some recognised authority. But as Jonathan Sumption points out, the scientific consensus is always changing. And if you think that science is fixed, the science is settled, well, then you don't really understand what science is. He said, once upon a time, the scientific consensus was that the sun moved around the earth and that blood did not circulate around the body. These propositions were refuted only because claims to a monopoly of knowledge failed and current orthodoxy was challenged by people who once were thought of as being heretics. Knowledge advances by confronting contrary arguments, not, he says, by suppressing them. So, Jonathan Sumption recommends to you this particular document. Turning to section 2, which is the preface, Laurence Fox says the following. I'll make some quotes from that. When certain views or statements are suppressed or outlawed, then segments of the population begin to feel disenfranchised, says Laurence Fox. included or excluded and protected by the system. Disquiet and division ensue, leading to disgruntlement, resentment, and ultimately instability. So which views, then, are currently not being heard, asks Laurence. Well, I ask you to consider things like the definitions of gender, or of race, or multiculturalism, or immigration, or religion, or climate change, or COVID decisions, vaccinations, vaccination passports, decisions taken by the NHS, national identity, and British history. None of these, he says, can be discussed openly today. Why aren't they? That's his question. And he points out that burn the witch is equivalent to what's shouted to everyone today who writes, illustrates, performs, or posts anything about these topics, which goes off the standard viewpoint that society wants everyone to take. The offender is openly denounced, suspended, dropped, sacked, and non-personed, and their career and livelihood is ended overnight. One can't help but think that Laurence Fox here is talking from personal experience after his experience of talking on Question Time and how he made some outspoken statements along some of these lines here and no longer has any work as an actor anymore. He says, and he goes on to say, that there are other people too who've suffered this kind of treatment. J.K. Rowling, Jenny Murray, Martina Navratilova, they're all vilified for sharing or publicly stating biological facts. That's about sex. David Bellamy, once so beloved of the nation, was summarily cancelled for daring not to bow at the altar of climate change. Now, says Laurence, who decides what these people are not allowed to hold their views? Who voted to bring in these punishments? And where has this licence for one group of citizens to punish another come from? Well, Laurence claims that it comes from the rather illiberal laws which have been adopted by this country and which don't protect people like that. All of this, he said, begs the crucial question: what can and what should be done? This report provides a serious and considered response, he says, and the report identifies areas in which freedom of speech must be preemptively reinforced before it is too late. Social media, in particular, needs to be looked at, and employment needs to be looked at, and also some of the activities of hate crimes need to be looked at too. He said the proposals in this report are narrow, targeted, and eminently achievable. Well, I'm not going to read to you the whole of the report or even go through it all, because I've given you a flavour of it. I'll summarise it in a moment. But let me just remind you of the content. So after we've had Jonathan Sumption, Laurence Fox has then an executive summary, so you could just read that part if you wish to read a small part which included a summary of the reforms. Part 4 is a revisitation of John Stuart Mill's famous outspoken book on liberty and how we've lost so much of the clarity of that thought. And then on section 5 he talks about freedom of speech and the law, and he talks about particularly the hate crime and public order bill, particularly the one that's going through Scotland at the moment, and the hate crime operational guidance of the College of Policing, which recommends that police record non-crime hate incidents and they go onto your record even though there is no crime been committed. He points that out as a weakness in our society. Section 6 is threats to freedom and to online speech, and for threats of freedom he actually points out things like fact-checking organisations are one of the important threats to freedom, as if they have a monopoly on the truth. You'll find that even the BBC uses fact-checking. Ofcom and the regulation of broadcasters is also now becoming a threat to freedom of speech. Censorship online, the natural idea of who is a publisher or what is a platform. Are things like Facebook publishers, or are they platforms? If they're platforms, then they should allow everyone equal access to their platform to say what they like and not try to intervene or censor them. If, on the other hand, they're publishers, then yes, you can censor what's said on your system, on your app. But then if you're a publisher, then you are open to prosecution if you allow people to say things on your that you publish widely. And that, of course, becomes then a difference between the two. If you see what's happening today, platforms like Facebook seem to require to have their cake and eat it. They want to be considered to be platforms where they are not prosecuted for what is said, and yet they want to be treated or act like publishers where they control what is being said themselves. The proposed online safety bill is something else he draws to our attention, and the new statutory protection from censorship. And finally, we have a freedom of expression and employment rights, and how, unfortunately, a lot of people seem to lose their employment if they express their thoughts freely, and he deals with that issue too. Let me summarise the points that you made. There are three essential reforms, says Laurence Fox, and he says you need this if you want to have something approaching what America has with the First Amendment to the Constitution of the freedom of speech. He says the three recommendations, or the three main recommendations, are as follows. Number one, the police should lose the power to investigate so-called non-crime hate incidents, and the Scottish hate crime bill should be scrapped. Number two, he says websites should be prevented from censoring content posted by users unless a criminal offence or a civil wrong is committed. Things like libel, slander, those kind of things. And thirdly, employers should no longer be able to sack people for their speech. And you'll find that if you want to see the arguments or the reasons for those kind of suggestions, then you can always read the report. I will leave the final word to Laurence Fox, who, when he introduced his report, said the following. He said, freedom of speech exists so that man may resolve conflicts with words rather than with weapons. Freedom of speech has been dealt a grievous blow in these last decades. The acceleration of its suppression in these last months should terrify us all. We must remember what we are and what this country has been built on and what it stands for. We must remember that civilization is built on the free, fair and full exchange of ideas. And if we don't, then all of us will come together. If we don't come together in its defence, then, he says, a descent into barbarism is unstoppable. So, the report on the protection of freedom of speech, legal analysis, and commissioned by the Reclaim Party. Recommended.